Loren Scott built dresses the way architects build bridges, with tension, with mathematics, with the understanding that beauty is a problem of engineering. On the morning of March 17, 2014, inside a Manhattan apartment on the corner of 11th Avenue, she was found dead. She was just 49 years old. Within hours, the news had crossed oceans, cancelling a Rolling Stones tour, detonating tabloid headlines, and exposing the financial fissures beneath one of fashion's most painstakingly constructed facades. What the world fixated on was her boyfriend Mick Jagger, who had been on stage in Perth 2 days prior. What the world largely missed was the woman herself, a self-invented force who had travelled from a small Mormon town in Utah to the upper atmosphere of international fashion, and who had for a decade been quietly building something extraordinary and fragile out of silk, precision, and sheer will. This is the story of the longest silhouette and the life and death of Loren Scott. Welcome to Society Mysteries. Laura Bambro came into the world on April 28, 1964, in Salt Lake City, Utah. She was adopted as an infant by Ivan and Lula Bambro, a devout Latter-day Saints couple who raised her in Roy, a small town hugging the Wasatch Front about 30 miles north of Salt Lake. Roy was the kind of place where everybody knew your name and your church attendance record, where Friday nights meant high school football and Saturday mornings meant yard work. It was not, by any stretch of imagination, a place that produced fashion designers. But Laura Bambro was not a typical Roy kid. She was adopted, for one thing, a fact that carried its own freight in a community where bloodlines and genealogies mapped neatly onto church records stretching back generations. And she was tall. Freakishly, gloriously tall, pushing 6 feet by the time she was in middle school, and eventually reaching 6'3", a beanpole in a town of compact, practical bodies. In the flatlands of suburban Utah, where finding a pair of jeans that reached her ankles was a genuine logistical ordeal, that height was not a gift, it was an affliction. The other girls didn't look like her. The racks at the local department stores didn't stock for her. So she started sewing, not as a hobby, but as a survival mechanism. She learned fit by necessity, construction by trial and error, and somewhere in the process she discovered that fabric was a medium through which she could control how the world perceived her body. She could make herself look the way she wanted to look, rather than the way her small-town circumstances dictated. That discovery that clothing was not decoration but freedom would become the cornerstone of everything that followed. She attended Roy High School, graduating in the early 1980s, and the exact timeline of her departure from Utah varies depending on who is telling the story, but every version converges on the same essential fact. At some point, around 1985, the photographer Bruce Weber either discovered her or encouraged her, or simply pointed in the direction of a door that was already ajar. She walked through it and landed in Paris. When she arrived, she was Laura Bambro. By the time she started working, she had become Loren. Paris in the mid-1980s was still the undisputed capital of fashion's old aristocracy, the couture houses, the ateliers, the photographers whose images dictated the visual grammar of desire across every magazine stand in the Western world. For a girl from Utah, it must have been like stepping through a looking glass into a parallel civilization. Loren Scott, modelled for Chanel and Thierry Mugler, walked through rooms where the air tasted like cigarettes and fracas, and absorbed an education in garment construction that no school could have replicated. She watched the petite man at work. She studied how master cutters thought about the body as a three-dimensional problem. What she took from those ateliers was not merely a working knowledge of seams and darts. It was an understanding of attitude, how fabric communicates authority, how a silhouette can reorganize the power dynamics of a room, how the right dress worn the right way can make a woman feel not just beautiful but invincible. One widely circulated image from this period, a hosiery advertisement for Pretty Polly, shot by David Bailey, in which her legs do all the talking. Bailey, never one to mince words, would later recall the casting with characteristic bluntness. They had seen thousands of girls, he said, and she had the best legs in the world. It was a throwaway line from a man who had photographed everybody and every body, but it stuck. Her body, its length, its proportions, its disciplined geometry became both her instrument and her argument. Modelling, though, was never going to be enough. She was too smart for it, too restless, and perhaps too aware that a model's shelf life is determined by other people's appetites. By the early 1990s, she had relocated to Los Angeles and begun reshaping herself again. In LA, she built a second career as a stylist, cultivating relationships with the photographers who controlled celebrity image making at the height of the supermodel era. Chief among them was Herb Ritts, whose sun-drenched hypersculptural portraits defined a particular species of American glamour. Working with Ritts was a masterclass in how to build a mythology around a body. Scott paid attention. The job that cemented her behind the camera credibility was the Elizabeth Taylor White Diamonds fragrance campaign, a high-stakes gig that demanded someone who could handle both the monumental ego of a screen goddess and the commercial requirements of selling perfume to Middle America. Scott pulled it off. Crucially, she did so without making noise. Throughout her career, she would insist on discretion as a professional ethic, consciously invoking the example of Edith Head, Hollywood's original invisible genius. Throughout my career, I have made it a rule never to talk about my clients or promote myself on the back of anyone else, she told Vogue. By the mid-1990s, she had pushed further still. Her credited work as costume designer on the 1996 thriller Diabolique marked her crossover into feature film. The wardrobe was all constriction and surface tension, tight silhouettes that dictated how the actors moved, clothes that were as much about restraint as about beauty. When a reporter asked about the physicality of the costume, she was characteristically precise. Breathing was not the issue, she said. The issue was movement. She was already thinking about fashion the way she would later design it as a form of architecture applied to flesh. The next big institutional milestone arrived in 2000, when she was appointed the official stylist for the Academy Awards ceremony, a liaison role between the fashion industry and Hollywood that placed her at a nexus of enormous visibility. It was the kind of position that should have made her famous in her own right. But fame for Loren Scott was always a double-edged blade. She began her relationship with Mick Jagger in 2001. The details of how they met are murky. Some accounts say a mutual friend, others leave it vague. But the relationship quickly became both a private anchor and a public trap. Jagger was, of course, Jagger, the man whose very name connotes sex, rock and roll, and the kind of fame that warps gravitational fields. For a woman who had spent 2 decades building professional authority through discretion and craft, becoming Mick Jagger's girlfriend in every headline was a particular kind of hell. She resisted the framing with a quiet, stubborn fury. "I'm a fashion designer," she told the Los Angeles Times. "I don't want to be defined as someone's girlfriend." But the media did what the media does. Every profile, every red carpet photo, every mention of her name in newsprint carried the gravitational pull of his. She could design the sharpest dress in the room and still be identified primarily as an appendage. They never married. They kept homes together in New York, London and Paris. A 2012 Vogue feature showcased their Left Bank apartment as a shrine to curated, exacting taste, every object placed with the deliberation of a set designer. And by all credible accounts, the relationship was serious, long-running, and deeply intertwined with her emotional and creative life. She designed clothes for him. She styled his world. Jagger would later describe her as his lover and best friend. But the structural imbalance of their public identities never resolved itself. In every photograph, at every event, on every red carpet, she was the woman next to him. The press had its shorthand, and no amount of professional accomplishment could override it. She was always more famous for who she loved than for what she made. For a woman who prized control, that asymmetry must have been a particular kind of torment. From 2006 onward, Loren Scott operated her own label, launching with what the fashion press called her Little Black Dress collection, and quickly establishing a signature aesthetic: body-conscious evening wear with couture-level detailing, sharp tailoring, and an old Hollywood sensibility that traded in controlled glamour rather than spectacle. Her clothes were designed for women who understood their own bodies. "Everyone's curves fall in a different place," she said. "You can't put something of mine on and not see curves." The client list was staggering. Nicole Kidman wore her on the red carpet. Sarah Jessica Parker wore her. Madonna wore her. Michelle Obama wore her. These were not women who needed to borrow a name. They chose Loren Scott because the clothes did something specific. They engineered confidence through fit, through what she called precision. That precision was intentional, she said. Every seam placement, every dart, every zipper was calibrated to sculpt the body into its best possible version of itself. By the late 2000s and early 2010s, she had achieved a kind of industry stature that placed her in a niche but rarefied segment of the luxury market. High price point, high craftsmanship, buy it once and keep it forever. Retail executives positioned her as the antidote to fast fashion. Julie Gilhart, then of Barney's New York, articulated the ethos plainly. Spend the money, yes, but wear the clothes year after year. Luxury is a state of mind, Scott herself declared in Time magazine, and her collections bore that out. They were not about trend chasing, but about a kind of disciplined, almost monastic devotion to silhouette. Brand extensions followed. A collaboration with Lancôme on a holiday colour collection in 2010. A debut fragrance, launched exclusively at Barney's New York in 2012, which she described as a long-held ambition, sent as enhancement, not disguise. She became a member of the Council of Fashion Designers of America, the institutional body that functioned as the American fashion establishment's imprimatur. She was profiled by Vogue, feted by editors, and taken seriously by the people whose opinions actually mattered inside the industry. She was also, by several accounts, exhausting to work with in the best possible way. Anna Wintour called her a total perfectionist. Simon Neen, the creative director of Banana Republic, who later collaborated with her, noted that she was never a diva. There was a difference. A diva demands attention. A perfectionist demands excellence. Loren Scott demanded excellence from every seam, every fitting, every last detail of production, and she held herself to the same standard. It was relentless, it was admirable, and it was, ultimately, unsustainable. The Banana Republic collaboration, announced in late 2013, was supposed to be a turning point, a capsule collection that would translate her signature glamour into a more accessible price bracket print she had designed herself, including a lip motif she had drawn by hand and floral patterns born from her self-professed passion for peonies. The collection launched in early December 2013 to warm reception, and in interviews she framed its tone as upbeat, festive, holiday-ready. It was the closest she had come to mass-market visibility, but behind the scenes, the arithmetic was merciless. Running an independent luxury label is by virtually every financial measure an act of controlled insanity. The unit costs are punishing. The production timelines are tyrannical. The gap between couture-level ambition and ready-to-wear cash flow is a chasm that swallows small designers whole, and Loren Scott's brand was no exception. Company filings with the United Kingdom's Companies House told a stark story. LS Fashion Limited, the UK-registered entity through which much of her business ran, had accumulated significant losses. Wire services and newspapers seized on the numbers. The narrative of a branding crisis began to harden in print. Her team pushed back. Representatives argued that the UK filings captured only a partial picture, that the business was multi-part, encompassing wholesale, bespoke couture, licensing and consulting, and that the most cited debt numbers did not represent the full financial reality. Fashion journalists who covered her closely cautioned against simplistic readings. The economics of independent luxury design are by their very nature brutal. Seasonal deadlines arrive with industrial regularity. Factory schedules are merciless. Cash flow lurches between collection cycles, and a single production delay can cascade into catastrophe. Loren Scott's difficulties were not unique. They were representative of an entire category of small designers grinding themselves down between couture ambition and ready-to-wear reality. But the damage of public reporting was done. Once the story of financial distress attached itself to her name, it proved impossible to dislodge. In February 2014, her London Fashion Week show was cancelled. The official explanation was production delays, the sort of logistical catastrophe that plagues small labels with punishing regularity. But, in retrospect, the cancellation became a loaded symbol, a narrative hinge that commentators would later point to as the moment the walls started closing in. Cathy Horan, one of the sharpest fashion critics alive, would subsequently reveal that Scott had been planning to close her business entirely. Yet Horan herself explicitly warned against drawing straight lines between business decisions and what came next. On the morning of March 17, 2014, Lorraine Scott was found dead in her Manhattan apartment. She had hanged herself. She was 49. Mick Jagger was in Australia. The Rolling Stones were midway through a tour, and the news reached him on the far side of the planet. The band immediately postponed the remaining Australia and New Zealand dates. Within hours, wire services had blasted the story around the globe, and the collision of rock and roll fame with private devastation produced a media frenzy that was, even by tabloid standards, ferocious. In a public statement, Jagger's grief was raw and bewildered. "I am still struggling to understand how my lover and best friend could end her life in this tragic way." Keith Richards echoed the shock with the blunt plainness of a man who had seen everything and still hadn't seen this. No one saw this coming. He wasn't the only one. In fact, her death is completely mysterious to most who knew her, and the facts paint an unusual picture. The night before she died, Lorraine hosted a dinner party. Friends attended. They were concerned about her. Cathy Horan would later report that she had been acting strangely in recent weeks, ducking phone calls, ignoring emails, disappearing by herself to Mustique. But no, they didn't think she would do something desperate, not Lorraine. She left no note. She gave no intimation of anguish that evening. In fact, at 8:30 on the morning of March 17th, she texted her assistant Brittany Penebre and asked her to come to the apartment. She didn't say why. By the time Penebre arrived at 10 o'clock, Scott was dead, found fully clothed, her 6'3" frame slumped on the floor, a black silk scarf tied to the handle of a French door. Penebre called for an ambulance, but there was nothing the paramedics could do. Later, Scott's body was removed from the building, the blue and white medical examiner's van, easing through a gathering crowd of photographers. It was the strangeness of it that haunted the people who knew her. The text to the assistant without any apparent thought for the trauma of what she would find, the absence of explanation, the eerie composure of a woman who had spent her whole life curating surfaces, now choosing to leave no final message at all. The days that followed were a parade of institutional mourning and tabloid grotesquerie, often running in the same news cycle. The fashion world issued statements of genuine grief. The CFDA called her a truly talented designer and a valued member of the CFDA family. Editors who had known her wrote tributes that tried, with varying degrees of success, to reclaim her identity from the headlines that still led with Jagger's name. A private funeral was held at Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles. A memorial service followed at St. Bartholomew's Church in New York. Her ashes were eventually buried near her adoptive parents in Utah, completing a geographic circle that spanned a continent and a lifetime of reinvention. Then came the will. It revealed that Lorraine Scott had left her entire estate, valued at approximately $9 million, to Mick Jagger. The language was deliberate and unambiguous. She named him directly and intentionally omitted all other heirs. The tabloids, predictably, erupted. Speculation about family estrangement, financial dependence, power imbalance, and a dozen other narratives flooded the coverage, even as the documentary record supported nothing beyond the legal outcome itself. The insurance fallout proved equally bruising. The Rolling Stones' postponed tour triggered a massive litigation chain that eventually reached settlement, but not before court documents introduced personal medical information into the public record, including references to Jagger's diagnosis of acute traumatic stress disorder, which had been triggered by Scott's death. The band objected to the privacy intrusion, but the damage was, once again, already done. Private tragedy had been processed through institutional machinery and spat out as public spectacle. For all the gloss of her public life with Jagger, the world of the Rolling Stones was never an easy one for Lorraine to inhabit. The band's inner circle was a closed ecosystem with its own loyalties and its own long memories, and some of its members never fully accepted any newcomer. Charlie Watts reportedly considered her a snob. Keith Richards, who had known Jagger since childhood and treated his romantic partners with varying degrees of warmth, was less subtle. He reportedly mocked her shoe size and referred to her behind her back as La Man. Even Jagger's front row presence at her fashion shows, which guaranteed press coverage, was a double-edged gift, because it reinforced the very framing she spent years trying to escape. She was the girlfriend, the plus one, the tall woman standing next to Mick. The Stones world was not hers, and it never quite let her forget it. And yet the people who actually knew her, not the tabloid version, not the Jagger appendage, but the woman herself, described someone almost impossible to reconcile with the violence of her end. Friends called her thoughtful, kind, sweet-natured. She remembered birthdays. She sent out of the blue texts telling people she was thinking of them. Her hairdresser, John Viol, recalled how she was always trying to connect him with wealthy contacts who might help his business. Always giving, always pushing others forward. Simon Neen from Banana Republic said his entire team loved working with her. She treated everyone the same, from pattern makers to executives. Anna Wintour called her generous, gracious and fun. Madonna said the same. But her friends also knew there were rooms in her life they were not invited into. Sarah Jessica Parker, speaking at the memorial, described her as a woman with silent boundaries that people instinctively understood not to cross. She was private to an almost pathological degree, adept at constructing a front so polished it could pass for serenity. Her estranged sister Jan Shane put it more bluntly. She was a super strong woman who simply never let anyone see her struggle. The mystery in the end was not why she died. No one can answer that, but how someone so attuned to the inner lives of others could have hidden her own so completely. Lorraine Scott's most tangible legacy lives not in the headlines or the court filings, but in fabric. The garments survive. Runway pieces, red carpet dresses, bespoke client work, and so does the visual archive of her shows. She was a woman who reinvented herself 3 times over, model, stylist, designer, and who built each iteration on the hard-won knowledge of the last. She understood bodies because she had lived in one that the world could not stop commenting on. She understood image because she had spent years constructing other people's. And she understood clothes because she had learned from the age of 12 in a small Utah town that what you wear is never just what you wear. It is a declaration of control over how you are seen. Lorraine Scott controlled that narrative with extraordinary skill for 30 years. That the world still chose to see her through someone else's name is not her failure. It is ours. A bit of a tragic tale this week, but I thought it was one that was worth telling. Let me know what you think about her in the comments. I've been Johnny, thanks for tuning in to Society Mysteries. I'll see you very soon.